The old wooden bench in Riverside Park had seen better days. Its green paint was chipping, and one of the metal armrests wobbled when you leaned against it. But for Grace, it was home. Not the kind of home most people would understand, but it was the closest thing she had to one. Every morning at sunrise, Grace would wake up from her sleeping spot behind the maintenance shed and make her way to this bench. She'd brush off the leaves, wipe away the morning dew, and settle in for another day of watching the world go by. The park was peaceful in the early hours. Dog walkers nodded politely as they passed. Joggers focused on their morning runs. Nobody bothered her, and she didn't bother anybody. Grace had been living this way for almost 2 years now. Life had thrown her some hard punches, and she was still trying to get back on her feet. She'd lost her job at the grocery store when the company downsized. Then came the medical bills when her diabetes got worse. Before she knew it, the small apartment she'd called home for 15 years was gone. The shelter was full most nights, so the park became her refuge. People looked at her differently now. She could see it in their eyes when they walked past. Some looked away quickly, pretending not to notice her worn clothes and the shopping cart that held everything she owned. Others stared with a mixture of pity and fear. Grace had learned to ignore both reactions. She kept to herself, minded her own business, and tried to stay invisible. But on this particular Tuesday afternoon, staying invisible became impossible. Grace was sitting on her usual bench, carefully dividing a peanut butter sandwich into 2 halves. She'd bought it with the $3 someone had given her that morning. The sandwich was supposed to be her lunch and dinner, but she had other plans for half of it. Miss Grace. Miss Grace. The voice belonged to Danny, a 7-year-old boy who had started showing up at the park about 3 weeks ago. The first time Grace saw him, he was sitting alone on the swings, looking sad and hungry. She'd offered him half of her apple, and he'd been coming back ever since. Danny was different from the other kids who played in the park. For one thing, he was always alone. Most children his age came with parents or babysitters, but Danny just appeared by himself every few days around lunchtime. He wore nice clothes, expensive-looking sneakers, clean shirts, and a fancy backpack that probably cost more than Grace spent on food in a month. But despite his nice clothes, Danny always seemed hungry. Really hungry, like he hadn't eaten in hours. And he was always eager to talk to someone, anyone who would listen to his stories about school, his favorite cartoons, or the games he liked to play. Grace had grown fond of the boy. He reminded her of her nephew back in Alabama, whom she hadn't seen since she'd moved to the city 5 years ago. Danny was polite, curious, and had a way of making Grace smile even on her worst days. "I was hoping you'd be here," Danny said, running up to the bench with his backpack bouncing behind him. "Well, where else would I be?" Grace smiled, patting the space next to her. "You hungry?" Danny nodded eagerly and climbed onto the bench. Grace handed him half of her sandwich, and they sat together in comfortable silence for a few minutes, watching the ducks paddle around in the small pond nearby. "My mom and dad had another big fight this morning," Danny said quietly, taking small bites of his sandwich to make it last longer. Grace felt her heart break a little. Over the past few weeks, Danny had told her bits and pieces about his home life. His parents were getting divorced, and they spent most of their time yelling at each other or talking to lawyers. Danny often got forgotten in the middle of all the adult drama. "I'm sorry to hear that, sweetie," Grace said gently. "That must be really hard for you." "Sometimes I just come here because it's quiet," Danny explained. "And because you're nice to me. You always share your food and you listen when I talk." Grace wrapped her arm around the boy's small shoulders. "You can come here anytime you need to, Danny. I'll always share what I have with you." What Grace didn't notice was the woman pushing a stroller on the path about 50 feet away. The woman had stopped walking and was staring at them with a concerned expression. She pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. "Mom, look at that lady with that little boy," said the woman's teenage daughter. "Doesn't that seem weird? Why would a homeless person be sitting with a kid like that?" The mother looked up from her phone and studied the scene more carefully. She saw Grace's weathered clothes, her shopping cart full of belongings, and her generally disheveled appearance. Then she looked at Danny with his clean clothes and expensive backpack. "Oh my God," the mother whispered. "I think something's wrong here. That doesn't look right at all." Within minutes, the woman had called 911. She spoke in hushed but urgent tones, describing what she saw as a suspicious situation involving a homeless woman and an unattended child. She mentioned that the woman appeared to be giving the boy food, which to her seemed like a classic way predators gained children's trust. Other park visitors began to notice the commotion. A jogger stopped to see what was happening. A couple walking their dog moved closer to get a better look. Soon a small crowd had gathered, all staring at Grace and Danny on the bench. Grace began to feel uncomfortable. She'd learned to recognize when trouble was coming, and the look she was getting from the growing crowd felt dangerous. "Danny," she said quietly, "I think maybe you should head home now." But before Danny could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. 2 police cars pulled into the park's small parking lot, their red and blue lights flashing. Grace's stomach dropped. She'd had enough run-ins with law enforcement since becoming homeless to know that this probably wasn't going to end well for her. "Stay calm," she whispered to Danny, who looked confused and frightened by all the attention they were suddenly getting. 4 police officers approached the bench. Their hands rested on their belt equipment, and their faces were serious and suspicious. "Ma'am, we need you to step away from the child," the first officer called out when he was still about 10 feet away. Grace's heart started pounding. "Officer, I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "Step away from the child now," the officer repeated, his voice louder and more commanding. Danny jumped off the bench and moved closer to Grace. "She's my friend," he said in a small voice. She didn't do anything wrong, but the crowd was getting louder. Grace could hear bits of their conversations, probably trying to kidnap him. "These homeless people, you never know." "Poor little boy." "Ma'am, put your hands where we can see them and move away from the child," another officer said. Approaching from the side, Grace slowly raised her hands, her mind racing. This was exactly the kind of situation she'd tried so hard to avoid. She'd been careful, kept to herself, stayed out of trouble. But here she was, about to be arrested for the simple act of sharing her lunch with a lonely little boy. "Please," Grace said, her voice shaking. "You don't understand. His name is Danny. He comes here by himself. I was just sharing my sandwich with him." But her words were drowned out by the crowd's growing excitement. Someone was recording everything on their phone. Others were calling out suggestions to the police about how dangerous homeless people could be. Danny started crying. "Don't take Miss Grace away," he pleaded with the officers. "She's nice. She takes care of me," but it was too late. The officers had made up their minds about what they were seeing. Grace felt the cold metal of handcuffs around her wrists as one of the officers read her rights. The crowd cheered as if justice had been served. As Grace was led toward the police car, she looked back at Danny, who was now surrounded by strangers trying to comfort him. The little boy who had just wanted someone to share lunch with was crying and reaching out for her. Grace realized that sometimes, no good deed goes unpunished. The fluorescent lights in the police station buzzed overhead as Grace sat in the hard plastic chair, her hands still trembling from the handcuffs that had been removed just minutes ago. The small interrogation room smelled like stale coffee and disinfectant. She'd been in places like this before, but never for something like this. Detective Lisa Chen walked into the room carrying a thick folder and a cup of coffee that had clearly been sitting around for hours. She was younger than Grace had expected, maybe in her early 30s, with tired eyes that suggested she'd seen too much in her career already. "Grace Washington," the detective said, reading from the folder. "Age 43, no permanent address." She looked up at Grace with a neutral expression. "Tell me about your relationship with the boy." Grace took a deep breath. She'd been thinking about how to explain this ever since they'd put her in the police car. How do you make someone understand that sometimes kindness happens between strangers? That not every interaction between a homeless person and a child is dangerous? "His name is Danny," Grace began. "He's been coming to the park alone for about 3 weeks now. Always by himself, always hungry. I started sharing my food with him because..." She paused, trying to find the right words. "Because he's just a little kid who needed someone to be kind to him." Detective Chen wrote something in her notebook. "And you didn't think it was strange that a 7-year-old was wandering around by himself?" "Of course I thought it was strange," Grace replied. "That's why I kept an eye on him. He told me his parents are going through a divorcee. And they're always fighting or meeting with lawyers. Sometimes they just forget about him." The detective looked skeptical. "So you decided to take care of him yourself?" "I decided to make sure he wasn't completely alone," Grace corrected. "There's a difference." Through the small window in the door, Grace could see activity in the main part of the police station. Officers were talking on phones, typing reports, and walking back and forth with purpose. She wondered what was happening with Danny. Was he scared? Was someone taking care of him? Detective Chen flipped through more pages in the folder. Grace, I have to ask you this directly. Did you ever touch this child inappropriately? Did you ever ask him to keep secrets about your meetings? Grace felt sick to her stomach. No, never. I would never hurt a child. All I ever did was share my food with him and listen when he wanted to talk. But you understand why people might be concerned about a homeless woman befriending a young child, especially one who appears to come from a wealthy family? There it was. The real issue. Grace had been dealing with people's assumptions about homeless individuals for 2 years now. She knew that many people saw her as dangerous, unpredictable, or morally questionable simply because she didn't have a permanent address. I understand that people make judgments, Grace said carefully, but being homeless doesn't make me a predator. It just makes me someone who's had some bad luck. Detective Chen continued asking questions for another hour. She wanted to know about Grace's background, her family, how she'd ended up homeless, and every detail about her interactions with Danny. Grace answered honestly, but she could tell the detective wasn't entirely convinced. Meanwhile, in another room down the hall, Danny sat with Officer Patricia Hayes, a specialist who worked with children in difficult situations. Danny had stopped crying, but he kept asking the same question over and over. When can I see Miss Grace again? Officer Hayes had been trying to get information about Danny's parents for the past 2 hours. The phone number he'd given them went straight to voicemail every time they called. The boy knew his home address, but when they'd sent a car to check the house, nobody was there. Danny, Officer Hayes said gently. Can you tell me more about Miss Grace? How did you meet her? Danny wiped his nose with the tissue she'd given him. I was sitting on the swings and I was really hungry. My mom and dad forgot to make me lunch that morning because they were yelling at each other. Miss Grace saw me and gave me half of her apple. And then what happened? I started going back to see her because she was nice to me. She always had food to share and she never yelled. At home, everyone's always yelling. Officer Hayes made notes as Danny talked. The picture he was painting didn't match what the witnesses at the park had described. Instead of a dangerous situation, it sounded like a lonely child had found comfort with a kind stranger. Did Miss Grace ever ask you to go anywhere with her? Or ask you to keep secrets? Danny shook his head. No, we just sat on the bench and talked. Sometimes we watched the ducks. She told me stories about when she was little and lived on a farm. Back in the interrogation room, Detective Chen was getting frustrated. Every piece of information they'd gathered was contradictory. The witnesses at the park were certain they'd seen something suspicious. They described Grace as acting strangely, possibly grooming the child or planning to take him somewhere. But Danny's account was completely different. He described Grace as a friend who shared her food and listened to his problems. He seemed genuinely attached to her and was upset about being separated from her. The thing is, Grace, Detective Chen said, closing her folder, we have several witnesses who called this in as a suspicious situation. They saw a homeless woman with a well-dressed child, and they were concerned for his safety. Because I'm homeless, Grace said quietly. Because the situation looked unusual, the detective corrected, though Grace could tell she was choosing her words carefully. A knock on the door interrupted their conversation. Another officer stepped into the room and whispered something to Detective Chen. Her expression changed as she listened. Grace, we've been trying to contact Danny's parents for hours. We finally reached his father's office and they said he's been in meetings all day. His mother is apparently at her lawyer's office, also unreachable. Neither parent seems to know that their child is missing. Grace felt a mix of vindication and sadness. She'd been telling the truth about Danny's situation, but it was heartbreaking to think that his parents didn't even know he was gone. So what happens now? Grace asked. Now we wait for his parents to get our messages and come pick him up. In the meantime, Child Services has been called. They'll want to investigate the family situation. And what about me? Detective Chen hesitated. That depends on what we find out when we talk to the parents. If they confirm your story about Danny coming to the park alone, then we'll probably let you go with a warning. A warning about what? About getting involved with unattended children. Even if your intentions were good, Grace, you put yourself in a vulnerable position, and you put that boy in a potentially dangerous situation. Grace wanted to argue, but she could see it wouldn't do any good. In the detective's mind, Grace was the problem in this situation. not the parents who had left their 7-year-old son to wander around the city alone. As the hours passed, Grace remained in the small room, waiting. She could hear the normal sounds of the police station through the walls, phones ringing, people talking, keyboards clicking. But all she could think about was Danny. Was he scared? Did he understand why they'd been separated? Around 6 o'clock in the evening, there was a commotion in the main part of the station. Grace could hear raised voices, people moving quickly, and what sounded like expensive shoes clicking on the tile floor. Detective Chen appeared in the doorway of the interrogation room, looking relieved but also somewhat embarrassed. "Grace," she said, "Danny's parents are here." Through the small window, Grace could see a well-dressed Asian man in an expensive suit talking animatedly with several officers. Next to him stood a woman with perfectly styled hair wearing designer clothes and carrying a purse that probably cost more than Grace had seen in months. These were Danny's parents. The people who had been too busy with their divorce proceedings to notice that their 7-year-old son had been missing for an entire day. "What happens next?" Grace asked. "Next, we find out if you've been telling us the truth," Detective Chen replied. "And if you have, then we have a very different problem on our hands." Grace watched through the window as Danny ran to his parents, hugging them tightly. But even from a distance, she could see that the reunion was complicated. The parents looked more angry than relieved. They seemed to be arguing with each other even as they held their son. Grace realized that her troubles were just beginning. The real story was about to come out, and she wasn't sure anyone was going to like what they learned. The child interview room at the police station was designed to be comforting. Soft chairs, colorful wall art, and a basket of toys in the corner were supposed to make kids feel safe. But Danny Chen sat stiffly in the big chair, his small legs dangling, looking anything but comfortable. Detective Chen had decided to speak with Danny one more time before his parents took him home. Something about the whole situation didn't sit right with her. The parents had been more concerned about their own reputations than their missing child. And Danny's reaction to seeing them had been strange, relief mixed with something that looked like disappointment. "Danny," Detective Chen said, settling into the chair across from him, "I know this has been a really long day for you, but I need to ask you some more questions about Miss Grace, okay?" Danny nodded, but his eyes kept drifting toward the door where he could hear his parents, arguing with the desk sergeant about media, attention, and whether their names would be in any reports. "Can you tell me again how you met Miss Grace?" Danny's face brightened a little when he talked about Grace. "It was 3 weeks ago, maybe 4 weeks. I was really sad because Mom and Dad had a big fight at breakfast, and Mom threw Dad's coffee cup at the wall. It broke into a million pieces," Detective Chen made a note. "So you went to the park after that?" "Well, first I went to school, but at lunch, instead of going to the cafeteria, I snuck out. I do that sometimes when I'm upset. The park is only 2 blocks away, and I know how to get there safely." "You leave school by yourself? Doesn't anyone notice?" Danny shrugged. "Lunchtime is really busy. Mrs. Rodriguez in the office is usually on the phone, and the teachers think I'm in the bathroom or something. I'm always back before afternoon classes start." This was news to Detective Chen. She'd assumed Danny was going to the park after school or on weekends, not during school hours. "How many times have you left school to go to the park?" "I don't know. Maybe 15 times, 20. I only do it when things are really bad at home and I need somewhere quiet to think." Detective Chen felt a knot forming in her stomach. This 7-year-old had been wandering the city alone multiple times and no one had noticed. Not his school, not his parents, not anyone except a homeless woman who had enough compassion to share her food with him. "Tell me about the first day you met Miss Grace." Danny swung his legs while he thought. "I was sitting on the swings and I was crying because I was hungry and..." sad. "Miss Grace was on her bench and she saw me. She walked over and asked if I was okay." "Were you scared of her?" "No," Danny said immediately. "She had a nice voice, kind of like my grandma back in California, and she looked sad too, so I thought maybe we could be sad together." "What did she do then?" "She asked if I was hungry and I said yes. So she went back to her bench and got half of her apple. It was really good. She said she was saving it for later, but she wanted to share it with me because kids should never be hungry." Detective Chen was beginning to understand why Grace had made such an impression on Danny. In a world where adults were too busy fighting to notice his needs, She had been the one person who consistently showed him kindness. Danny, did Miss Grace ever ask you about your family? About where you lived or anything like that? Yeah, she asked me why I was always alone. So I told her about the divorce. She said divorce is hard on kids and that it wasn't my fault that my parents were fighting. Did you tell her your real name? Your address? Danny nodded. I told her my name was Danny Chen, and I lived in the big white house on Maple Street. She said she knew the neighborhood because she used to work at the grocery store there before she lost her job. Detective Chen realized that Grace had known exactly who Danny was and where he lived. She could have contacted his parents or the school at any time. Instead, she'd chosen to simply be there for him when he needed someone. Can you tell me more about why you kept going back to see Miss Grace? Danny's expression grew serious. Because she was the only person who listened to me. At home, Mom and Dad are always yelling at each other or talking on the phone with lawyers. When they do talk to me, it's usually to ask which parent I want to live with when they get divorced. But I don't want to choose. I just want them to stop fighting. And Miss Grace didn't ask you to choose sides? No, she just listened. She told me that grown-ups sometimes make mistakes and hurt each other, but that doesn't mean they don't love their kids. She said I was brave and smart, and that things would get better eventually. Detective Chen found herself admiring Grace's wisdom. Despite her own difficult circumstances, she'd found ways to comfort and reassure a troubled child without overstepping boundaries or criticizing his parents. Danny, this is important. Did Miss Grace ever ask you to keep secrets about your visits to the park? No, she told me I should always tell my parents where I was going, but... Danny hesitated. But what? But my parents never ask where I go after school. They're usually too busy fighting or on the phone. Sometimes I don't see them until dinner, and they just ask if I did my homework. The picture Danny was painting was heartbreaking. Here was a 7-year-old boy so neglected by his feuding parents that he'd been regularly leaving school to find emotional support from a stranger in the park, and that stranger had turned out to be more attentive to his needs than his own family. Has Miss Grace ever asked you to go anywhere with her? Maybe to her house or somewhere else? Miss Grace doesn't have a house, Danny said matter-of-factly. She sleeps in the park sometimes. I asked her why, and she said that sometimes grown-ups have hard times and lose their homes, but that doesn't make them bad people. She said she was working on getting back on her feet. Did that scare you? No, it made me sad for her. That's why I always ate whatever she shared with me, even when I wasn't that hungry. I didn't want her to think I didn't appreciate it. Detective Chen was running out of questions, but she had one more important thing to ask. Danny, when the police officers came to the park today, you seemed upset that they were taking Miss Grace away. Can you tell me why? Danny's eyes filled with tears again. Because she's my friend. The only real friend I have. She never lies to me or makes promises she can't keep. She just sits with me and makes me feel like I matter. Your parents love you, Danny. I know they do, Danny said quietly. But they love fighting with each other more than they love spending time with me. Miss Grace always had time for me. Just then, there was a loud knock on the door. Danny's father, Mr. Chen, appeared in the doorway looking impatient and angry. How much longer is this going to take? He demanded. My son has been traumatized enough for one day. He needs to come home and forget about this whole incident. Detective Chen stood up slowly. She'd heard enough to know that Grace Washington was innocent of any wrongdoing. In fact, she'd done more to protect and care for Danny than his own parents had been doing for weeks. Mr. Chen, she said carefully, we need to have a serious conversation about your son's safety and well-being. What do you mean? I mean that Danny has been leaving school during lunch hours to visit the park. Sometimes for weeks at a time, and neither you nor your wife noticed he was missing. Mr. Chen's face went pale. That's impossible. Danny comes home every day after school. But you're not there when he comes home, are you? Detective Chen asked. According to Danny, you and your wife are usually busy with your divorce proceedings. For the first time since arriving at the station, Mr. Chen looked genuinely concerned about his son, rather than just angry about the inconvenience. Danny, he said, kneeling down to his son's level. Is that true? Have you been leaving school? Danny nodded, unable to meet his father's eyes. Why didn't you tell us you were upset? Because you and Mom are always too busy yelling to listen, Danny said simply. The silence in the room was deafening. Detective Chen watched as the reality of the situation finally hit Danny's father. The homeless woman they'd arrested for endangering his child, had actually been protecting him while his own parents were too distracted to notice he was in trouble. Mr. Chen sat down heavily in one of the small chairs, his expensive suit looking out of place in the colorful room. For the first time, he looked less like a successful businessman and more like a father who had just realized how badly he'd failed his son. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Detective Chen looked at Danny, then back at his father. "Now we figure out how to make sure this never happens again." The police station lobby had been relatively quiet until 7:30 p.m. Officers were finishing their paperwork. A few people sat waiting to file reports, and the usual evening calm was settling over the building. Then the sound of a powerful engine roaring to life outside shattered the peace. Officer Martinez looked up from his desk as a bright yellow Lamborghini pulled into the parking lot with a screech of expensive tires. The car was so out of place in the modest neighborhood that several people outside stopped walking to stare at it. "Well, that's not something you see every day," Martinez muttered to his partner. The Lamborghini's driver door opened, and out stepped a man in his early 40s wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that probably cost more than most people made in a month. His hair was slightly messy, suggesting he'd been running his hands through it, and his usual composed businessman demeanor was nowhere to be found. This was William Chen, Danny's father, and he was panicking. William had spent the entire day in emergency mediation sessions with his divorce lawyers, trying to sort out the custody arrangement that had been dragging on for months. His phone had been turned off during the proceedings as required by the court. It wasn't until he'd gotten back to his Tesla in the parking garage that he'd seen the 17 missed calls from the police department. The first message had made his blood run cold. "Mr. Chen, this is Detective Chen with the Metro Police. We have your son Danny here at the station. Please call us immediately." William had tried calling his ex-wife Jennifer immediately, but her phone was also off. She was probably still in her own lawyer's office, fighting over who would get the beach house and the investment accounts. Meanwhile, their 7-year-old son had been sitting in a police station for hours. The second car to arrive was a white BMW that pulled up just as William was rushing toward the police station entrance. Jennifer Chen stepped out of the driver's seat looking equally frantic. Her usually perfect makeup was smudged, and her designer handbag was clutched so tightly in her hands that her knuckles were white. "William," she called out as she hurried toward him. "What the hell is going on? Why is Danny at a police station?" "I don't know any more than you do," William replied, his voice tight with worry and guilt. "I've been in mediation all day. My phone was off." "Mine too," Jennifer said. "The lawyers insisted on it. God, what if something happened to him?" They rushed into the police station together, their usual animosity temporarily forgotten in their shared panic about their son. The desk sergeant looked up as the expensively dressed couple approached his counter. "We're Danny Chen's parents," William said breathlessly. "We got calls that he's here?" "Yes, sir. Let me get Detective Chen for you right away." As they waited, William and Jennifer stood awkwardly next to each other, the weight of their mutual guilt heavy in the air. 6 months ago, they would have been holding hands, supporting each other through a crisis like this. Now they could barely look at each other without starting an argument. Detective Chen appeared within minutes, looking tired but relieved to see them. "Mr. and Mrs. Chen, thank you for coming. We've been trying to reach you for hours." "We were both in court-mandated mediation," Jennifer explained. "Our phones had to be turned off." "What happened to Danny?" Detective Chen led them to a small conference room and gestured for them to sit down. "And your son is fine," she said immediately, seeing the fear in their eyes. "He's not hurt and he's not in any danger. But we need to talk about what happened today." "Where is he?" William demanded. "I want to see my son." "He's in our child-friendly waiting room with Officer Hayes. You'll see him in just a few minutes. But first, I need to explain the situation." Detective Chen opened her folder and looked at the two parents sitting across from her. In her 15 years on the force, she'd seen plenty of family drama. But this case was particularly troubling because it revealed just how much a child could slip through the cracks when adults were too focused on their own problems. This afternoon, we received multiple calls about a suspicious situation in Riverside Park. Witnesses reported seeing a homeless woman with an unattended child. When officers arrived, they found Danny sitting on a bench with a 43-year-old homeless woman named Grace Washington. Jennifer gasped. "Oh my God, was he kidnapped? Did she hurt him?" "No," Detective Chen said firmly. But the situation is more complicated than that. Danny told us that he's been visiting this woman regularly for the past 3 to 4 weeks. He says she shares her food with him and listens when he needs someone to talk to. William frowned. That doesn't make sense. Danny comes home from school every day. He's never mentioned any homeless woman. Mr. Chen, Detective Chen said carefully, when was the last time you actually spoke with Danny about his day? Not just asking if he did his homework, but really talking to him about how he's feeling? The question hung in the air like an accusation. William and Jennifer looked at each other, both trying to remember the last real conversation they'd had with their son that wasn't about the divorce or logistics. We've been busy with the divorce proceedings, Jennifer said defensively, but we always make sure Danny is taken care of. He has everything he needs. Mrs. Chen, did you know that Danny has been leaving school during lunch hours to visit the park, sometimes multiple times per week? The color drained from Jennifer's face. That's impossible. The school would have called us. Apparently, he's been slipping out during busy lunch periods and returning before afternoon classes. No one noticed because he's a good student who doesn't cause trouble. William felt sick to his stomach. How long has this been going on? According to Danny, he started doing this about a month ago. He says he goes to the park when things at home are particularly stressful. When you and your wife are fighting. The silence in the room was deafening. Both parents were beginning to realize that while they'd been focused on dividing their assets and fighting over custody arrangements, their 7-year-old son had been so neglected that he'd sought comfort from a stranger in the park. Is he okay? Jennifer whispered. Did anyone hurt him? Physically, he's fine. Emotionally. Detective Chen paused. He's been dealing with a lot of stress. According to him, this homeless woman, Grace, has been the only adult in his life who consistently listens to him and shows him kindness. William's successful businessman facade finally cracked completely. We love our son, he said, his voice breaking. We're just going through a difficult time. I understand that divorce is hard on everyone, Detective Chen replied. But your difficult time has left your 7-year-old son so desperate for attention and care that he was willing to trust a complete stranger rather than come to either of you with his problems. Jennifer started crying. We never meant for this to happen. We thought we were protecting him by not involving him in our issues. Instead, you left him to deal with his feelings entirely alone. And he's 7 years old, Mrs. Chen. 7-year-olds shouldn't have to manage that kind of emotional burden by themselves. There was a knock on the door, and Officer Hayes appeared with Danny behind her. When Danny saw his parents, he ran to them, hugging them both tightly. But Detective Chen could see that even in this moment of reunion, the boy looked exhausted and sad. Mom, Dad, you came, Danny said, his voice muffled against his father's expensive suit jacket. Of course we came. Buddy, William said, holding his son close. We're so sorry we didn't get the messages sooner. Danny, Jennifer said, kneeling down to his level. Honey, why didn't you tell us you were upset? Why didn't you come to us instead of going to the park? Danny looked down at his shoes. Because you're always busy fighting or talking to lawyers. And when you do talk to me, it's usually about the divorce. I didn't want to make things worse. The words hit both parents like a physical blow. In their determination to protect Danny from their marital problems, they'd created an environment where he felt like his own emotional needs were a burden. Detective Chen watched the family reunion with mixed feelings. She was relieved that Danny was safe and that his parents clearly loved him. But she was also concerned about what would happen when they left the police station. Would they learn from this experience? Or would they go back to their old patterns once the immediate crisis was over? Mr. and Mrs. Chen, she said, there's one more thing we need to discuss. The woman who was with Danny today, Grace Washington, is still here at the station. She was arrested because witnesses thought she was endangering your son, but based on everything Danny has told us, she was actually protecting him. William looked confused. What do you mean? I mean that while you two were too busy with your divorce to notice that your son was regularly leaving school and wandering the city alone, a homeless woman with nothing to gain was making sure he was fed and safe. The implications of Detective Chen's words sank in slowly. The person they should be thanking was sitting in an interrogation room, treated like a criminal for the crime of showing kindness to their neglected child. We need to make this right, William said quietly. Detective Chen nodded. Yes, you do. The question is how. Grace sat in the interrogation room, staring at the clock on the wall. It was almost 8 p.m., and she'd been in the police station for over 6 hours. Her stomach was growling. She hadn't eaten anything since the half sandwich she'd shared with Danny, but she was too nervous to ask for food. Through the small window in the door, she could see Danny with his parents in the hallway. The boy looked small between the two well-dressed adults, and Grace could tell even from a distance that the conversation they were having was serious. Danny kept glancing toward the room where Grace was waiting, his face full of worry. Detective Chen appeared in the doorway, followed by Danny's parents. Grace had seen them briefly when they'd arrived, but this was her first close look at the people who had created the sweet, lonely boy she'd grown to care about. William Chen was tall and imposing in his expensive suit, the kind of man who was used to being in control of every situation. Jennifer Chen was elegant and polished, with the kind of careful beauty that took considerable time and money to maintain. They both looked like they belonged in magazine advertisements for luxury cars or vacation resorts. Grace looked down at her own worn clothes and wished she could make herself invisible. "Grace," Detective Chen said, "I'd like you to meet Danny's parents, William and Jennifer Chen." Grace stood up slowly, unsure of what to expect. Were they here to yell at her? To demand that she stay away from their son? To threaten legal action? Instead, William Chen stepped forward and extended his hand. "Ms. Washington," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "I owe you an enormous apology." Grace was so shocked that she almost forgot to shake his hand. What?" Jennifer Chen moved closer, her eyes red from crying. "We owe you so much more than an apology," she said. "We owe you our gratitude. Danny told us what you've been doing for him, and we're ashamed that a stranger has been taking better care of our son than we have." Grace felt dizzy. This was not the conversation she'd been expecting. "I just shared my food with him. He was hungry and alone." "You did much more than that," William said. "You gave him something we've apparently failed to provide, someone who listens to him and makes him feel valued." Detective Chen gestured for everyone to sit down around the small tea. "Abel." "Grace, the Chens understand now that you were protecting Danny, not endangering him. All charges against you are being dropped." Grace felt a wave of relief wash over her, but she was still confused about why Danny's parents were being so kind to her. In her experience, wealthy people weren't usually sympathetic to homeless individuals, especially when their children were involved. "Can I ask you something?" Grace said tentatively. "Why wasn't Danny with you today? He said you were both in meetings, but he's just 7 years old." William and Jennifer exchanged a look full of guilt and regret. "We're getting divorced," Jennifer explained. "We've been so focused on the legal proceedings that we've been neglecting Danny's emotional needs. We thought we were protecting him by keeping him out of our conflicts, but instead we just made him feel invisible." "He's not invisible," Grace said firmly. "He's a wonderful little boy who just needs someone to pay attention to him." "You're right," William said. "And that someone should have been us." Grace studied the two people sitting across from her. They seemed genuinely remorseful, but she'd learned to be wary of wealthy people's promises. "So what happens now? Are you going to forbid Danny from coming to the park?" "Actually," William said, "we were hoping we could talk to you about something else entirely." Grace raised her eyebrows. "Such as?" William took a deep breath. "I own a technology company downtown. We've been planning to open an employee wellness center, a place where our workers can go to decompress, talk through problems, and get support when they're dealing with stress." "Okay," Grace said, not sure where this was going. "We've been looking for someone to run the center, someone with natural empathy and wisdom, someone who knows how to listen and make people feel valued." William paused. "Someone like you," Grace stared at him. "Are you offering me a job?" "I'm offering you more than a job," William said. "The position comes with a full benefits package, including health insurance and housing assistance. We have partnerships with several apartment complexes in the city." Grace felt like she was dreaming. 6 hours ago she'd been arrested and treated like a criminal. Now a wealthy businessman was offering her employment and housing. "Why would you do this?" "Because," Jennifer said, "you showed our son more genuine care in 3 weeks than we've shown him in 3 months. Because you have qualities that can't be taught or bought. And because we want to make sure that good people like you don't slip through the cracks." "Also," William added with a slight smile, "Danny made us promise that we'd find a way to help you. He was very concerned about you being arrested." Grace felt tears welling up in her eyes. After 2 years of being invisible, ignored, and judged, these people were seeing her as valuable. "I don't know what to say." Say you'll think about it, William suggested. You don't have to decide right now. But we'd like to offer you a temporary place to stay tonight while you consider our offer. There's a corporate apartment we use for visiting executives that's sitting empty. Detective Chen, who had been quietly observing this conversation, smiled. Grace, I think this might be the first time in my career that an arrest has led to someone getting a job offer. Grace looked around the room at these people who, just hours ago, had been strangers. Danny's parents had gone from seeing her as a threat to viewing her as a blessing. Detective Chen had moved from suspicion to respect, and somehow, her simple act of sharing food with a lonely child had changed everyone's life. There's one condition, Grace said finally. William and Jennifer looked at her expectantly. I want to make sure Danny is okay. I want to know that you're going to pay attention to him and take care of his emotional needs. We've already enrolled in family counseling, Jennifer said. All three of us together. We realized today that we need help learning how to communicate better. And we're restructuring our custody arrangement, William added. Instead of fighting over who gets more time with Danny, we're focusing on making sure that the time we each have with him is quality time. No phones, no lawyers, no business calls during Danny time. Grace nodded approvingly. He's a special kid. He deserves parents who see that. He does, Jennifer agreed. And he also deserves to know that the person who took care of him when we failed is going to be okay. 3 weeks later, Grace was settling into her new apartment. It was small but clean, with actual furniture and a refrigerator that she could fill with food. She had her own key, her own address, and her own bank account where her paychecks were deposited every 2 weeks. The Employee Wellness Center had opened to great success. Grace discovered that her years of observing people and listening to their problems had given her skills that were perfectly suited for helping stressed-out office workers. She was good at her job, and more importantly, she enjoyed it. On Saturday afternoons, she still went to Riverside Park, but now she sat on the same bench with a different purpose. Danny came to visit her every weekend, accompanied by whichever parent had custody that day. Sometimes William came and they talked about business and life. Sometimes Jennifer came and they discussed Danny's progress in school and therapy. The park bench had become a symbol of something beautiful. The place where a homeless woman and a neglected child had found each other and, in the process, had saved each other's lives. Grace often thought about how quickly everything had changed. One act of kindness, sharing half a sandwich with a hungry child, had transformed multiple lives. She'd gained not just a job and a home, but a family. Danny had gained not just better parents, but the knowledge that he was worthy of love and attention. And William and Jennifer had gained the wake-up call they needed to become the parents their son deserved. The story that had started with suspicion and fear had ended with understanding and hope. Grace had learned that sometimes the people who seem to have the least to offer actually have the most to give. And the Chen family had learned that real wealth isn't measured in money or possessions, but in the connections we make with the people who matter most. As Grace sat on her bench that Saturday afternoon, watching Danny feed the ducks while his parents sat beside her, she smiled. Sometimes the most unexpected friendships lead to the most extraordinary changes, and sometimes all it takes is someone willing to share half of their sandwich with a stranger who needs it.